I really quite regret providing such an uninteresting description of myself. So don't let it put you off approaching me in the breaks or coming days. I'm aware that we've eaten into the break quite a bit, is that right? So I'm going to try and compress what was going to be a 15-minute presentation into something quite short. So following that introduction to the report, I was going to talk about just some of the key data and the key figures in the report, but actually speaking to Suzanne this morning, I realized that perhaps the most interesting parts of the report were actually the case studies and examples of good practice going on in the region. And this really showed that there's no single way of dealing with any of the issues going on. However, I haven't covered that, so I recommend you do pick up a report down the corridor. There's a stand set up, and read about it. So, where possible... Oops, how do we do this? Okay. So where possible, I'm going to really cut it down. So it wasn't meant to be such an abridged thing. So based on the 5 Ps, if we begin with... Oops. Which way do I point it? Oh, I turned it off, right? Oh, I see. Okay, so the report cites, I think, that 85 million young people are in extreme poverty in Asia and Pacific. But this is needs to be noted that it's an underestimate and based solely on population proportions due to the lack of age disaggregated data. What we do have, and what we've used here, is regional data for working poverty, just to show that despite the progress over the last decade and 2 decades, youth are consistently disproportionately represented in the poor, and they exhibit higher poverty rates than adults across the regions. Malnutrition, not a lot of data for youth, but needs to be remembered that youth are a pivotal age group in this regard, as essentially in transition on a number of levels. So school to work, childhood to adolescence, adolescence to adulthood. As such, when there's malnutrition, undernourishment and hunger, and it affects children and youth, this affects the whole life trajectory. I'm not going to go through the various data, but for the sake of time. Risks from adolescent consumption choices. The chart shows alcohol consumption by region for adolescents. Don't get me wrong, we're not saying that youth should not drink alcohol. What we're saying is that this is a proxy, excessive drinking is a proxy to unsustainable consumption choices for individuals. In itself, it can represent general societal discontent, discouragement, or even a lack of understanding as to what constitutes a healthy lifestyle. Youth urbanization, this again has already been touched upon. 16 of the world's 28 megacities are now found in Asia Pacific, Manila included. The youth, which form, I think, a very large part of the migration from rural to urban areas, tend to be more exposed to exploitation and hardship, and often find themselves in poverty specific to urban settings. Sanitation, I won't go through the individual cases here, but it's a particular challenge for rural areas where, as of 2014, 46% of the population in Asia Pacific had access to improved sanitation, compared with 75% in urban areas. and this corresponds to 1.7 billion people in the region without access to clean water and sanitation. Another concern is that 780 million people still practice open defecation, and some 80% of wastewater is discharged without being treated into waterways across Asia. Encouragingly, and notwithstanding a few exceptions in Afghanistan, Pakistan, Papua New Guinea, universal gross primary education enrollment has been achieved across Asia Pacific. Disparities then start to happen with secondary and tertiary education, but as shown in this chart, while there still are major gaps between high-income countries at the top and levels of enrollment and low income at the bottom, the breakdown by gender does show that in some cases more women are enrolled in certain levels of education than men, which suggests really that potential weakening of discriminatory gender roles. Youth exhibit elevated unemployment rates. Youth are always going to have higher unemployment rates than adults. You are, after all, at the beginning of your careers, you don't have the experience yet, all the contacts and the networks in order to make headway as fast as adults can. However, the ratio of youth to adult unemployment is quite excessive, and it suggests that there can be either extended amounts of time looking for work or mismatches between skills and job requirements. I'm not going to talk about social protection, but just, very briefly, on average, 2 to 3% of GDP is spent on social protection in Asia Pacific. This compares to around 20% for OECD countries, and it's largely inadequate and insufficient, particularly for youth unemployment. Again, the report draws on survey findings on how youth view civil society and how they consider themselves or yourselves represented and your voice being heard. And there was a tendency to see low trust in institutions and lack of confidence in the system. In this regard, there's a real need for better platforms and integration with yourselves and policymakers, and ultimately partnerships. The last P, which I'm not going to talk about, but I will use because this forum is representation of this, but I'll wrap up anyway. The primary objective of the Switchon Report was to highlight how youth feature throughout the SDGs and how addressing youth issues are fundamental to achieving the SDGs. As mentioned earlier, the report provides an overview of the current state of youth in Asia Pacific, and in doing so draws on opportunities and challenges. Many of what you see in the report is a little bit doom and gloom. There's a lot of challenges and how youth are disproportionately impacted by this and that. But what needs to be remembered is that when there are problems and challenges, there are equally solutions and opportunities. And I have every confidence that in the coming days, these discussions, debates, the brainstorming, capacity building, we can help facilitate the identification of these solutions and opportunities. And ultimately, I hope that many of the trends and findings outlined in the report can begin to diminish. Thank you for your time.